After just getting done with the press beta build for Diablo 4, we got a lot of great insight into what the early game was going to look like, as well as a ton of the systems that are already in the game. What I wanted to cover today is how the skill system works in general, giving you a breakdown of what to expect on how you're going to be able to skill, how those skills will work together, what the different synergies are, and the total progression of the skill tree system. We're going to be using some examples from the actual build that we just saw, so these are going to be what the skill descriptions currently say, just to be able to highlight the type of verbiage and information that you get inside of the skill tree that helps you to go forward and make the decisions on what path you're going to take in your own particular character journey. And just like the little watermark down in the bottom of this video right now, everything that I'm about to show you is subject to change. This is not the finalized version of the game. You won't be seeing any in-game footage, but what we do have access to is prepared game footage along with prepared game stills, and then the information that I was able to copy from what we saw in the game and what we're able to discuss. So just remember that disclaimer. Everything I'm about to show you may change at any moment. None of this is set in stone. But I figured it'd be great for people to get their hands on what the system is going to look like in general, so that when you first boot up the game, you're not caught completely unawares and you're going to have a good idea of what you should be doing to build a competent character that will carry you into the end game. So here's a look at just a single part of the sorceress skill tree. You get this idea of what the skills do, what kind of damage they're going to do, whether or not they have cooldowns, etc. First off, I'd just like to say, based off my first impressions being able to play through this level 1 through 25 experience, basically seeing the entirety of the first act of the game, the skill tree systems in Diablo 4 are incredibly well constructed and rewarding for people who are willing to take the time, read through everything, and really plan out a synergistic set of skills that they can use moving forward. From the level 1 skills that you're able to pick all the way down to your ultimates and big passive skills, every decision that you make absolutely builds towards one cohesive playstyle, and figuring out how each one of them kind of fits into the jigsaw puzzle that will be your character's loadout in the end game. The other thing I would just quickly say, and this one's a little bit harder to quantify, but I never really felt as if any of the skills in any one of the skill trees was just a dead skill altogether. Now, I will say I think that there are definitely better skills, and I think that there will be builds that are ultimately stronger than other ones. But with the very limited scope of what we were able to see, every skill that I picked up and tried out had a distinctive feel, distinctive play style, as well as required me to attack each individual encounter differently based off of what tools I had. I would say that's a really good experience getting my hands on it, and I felt rewarded regardless of which avenue I took and which skills I picked. But let's go ahead and break down each one of the bits of the anatomy of these skill descriptions, because everything that you're seeing on the screen is incredibly important to understand both how the skill works and how it's going to interact with every other skill in your skill tree. So excuse the paint skills, because we aren't able to take any screenshots from the actual build that we played inside of. I had to go and build my own so you could more easily get an idea of what I'm going to be describing, and I kind of break down skills into each one of these different nodes that you saw in the previous image. While every class is going to have some mix-up here, there are basically a set of standards that you can expect from each different node, because just like you would progress through your character's story, your skill tree progresses through power, utility, etc. You can have 6 skills on your skill bar at any given time. For the controller, these are mapped out to the trigger buttons and the shoulder buttons, as well as X and Y. And then on mouse and keyboard, you're going to have your generator skill on left click, which is your primary basic skill. You're going to have your spender skill on right click. That's the thing that your generator empowers. And then you're going to have a selection of 4 other skills across 1, 2, 3, and 4. Going back to this picture here, I want to highlight a couple different things. So obviously you have your skill name here. You also have how many ranks you can put into that skill, because multiple skills allow you to put multiple ranks into them to make them stronger. You have your skill tags. These are going to identify what type of skill it is, because there are in-game effects as well as stats on gear that relate to specific types or tags on your skills. You'll have any information that relates to how much of your resource it generates, how much of your resource that it costs, and whether or not it has a cooldown. Something that's missing from here, because the advanced tooltips is not showing, is how much lucky hit chance the skill has. The majority of skills that we saw in the build have something called lucky hit. Lucky hit basically means this percentage of the time when you use this skill, any of your gear or other skills that say lucky hit have a chance to proc. You then have the skill description itself, and then what's really important to note is that the damage type of the skill, if it is an attack, will also be listed. While a lot of the skills in the game seem to be physical damage skills, there are a ton of different stats on gear like amulets and rings that will buff particular damage types versus not buffing other types. You could expect to find plus to fire skill damage on some gear the sorceress might get their hands on. When I say generator skills, I'm talking about the first sphere of skills that you have, which are your basic skills. Basic skills are just that, they're pretty basic. They're going to begin to define a little bit of the playstyle and the build identity that you're creating, and they're going to generate your primary resource. So every class has a resource that's required to use on certain skills, which are typically in the core section of skills. While your generator skills may be relevant throughout the entirety of your character's progression, they're typically weaker abilities that bring more utility and resource rather than necessarily pumping out a ton of damage. To get a better idea of what I'm talking about here, I made a sheet that goes over every part of a skill's anatomy, and I'll explain each part. So here in white, I have an example of one of your basic skills. So now that we understand the anatomy, let's take a look at Lunging Strike and what it has to offer. As a basic skill, it's not going to carry a cooldown, and it's going to generate our primary resource. On the Barbarian, that's Fury. So every time I attack with Lunging Strike, I'm going to generate 9 Fury, and it looks like every class starts off with a pool of 100 of their primary resource. Some generate it more passively, some generate it only via using skills, and it's going to be specific to that class. Because it's a generator skill, it's not going to use any of your primary resource, and Lunging Strike has a 50% lucky hit chance. So half of the time when you use this attack, you're going to have an opportunity to proc any lucky hit chance abilities that you have on your skills or on your gear. The skill itself lunges forward and it's going to strike an enemy, dealing an amount of damage. What's really interesting in the skill tooltips is that the number in the brackets here are representative of how this damage is being calculated, and the number here is related to your weapon damage. The stronger weapon damage that you have on your skill, the more damage these skills are going to do, because they're always going to do some percentage of your weapon damage. The damage type for Lunging Strike is physical, and it's a generator skill type. Looking back at this picture, you'll notice that after the skill, you have these smaller skill nodes that seem to branch off. These are enhancements to those skills. So once you actually put a point into this, it will permanently change some aspect of the skill itself, and then you are normally only able to pick one or the other option as far as your second enhancement. These are going to bring very specifically different types of either utility, damage, or functionality to the skill as a whole, and typically are going to define the type of build that you're going for. So while one may add additional crowd control to your effect, the other one may add some additional defensives, life gain, or fortify gain. For Lunging Strike, the first enhancement slot is Enhanced Lunging Strike. This says that if you were to hit a healthy enemy, so an enemy that has greater than 80% of its life remaining, you're going to deal additional damage and heal for an amount of the damage equal to the maximum life that you have. And then to give you an idea of what a secondary enhancement type looks like, we have Battle Lunging Strike. Battle Lunging Strike is going to inflict a bleeding damage over time dot to the target hit with Lunging Strike. So this gives you an idea of how a basic skill is then modified by their enhancements, and how choosing one versus the other can really go a long way to define what that skill will do for your particular kit. You need to spend a certain amount of skill points to be able to build down into the next node. So between basic and core skills, you need to have at least 3 skill points spent before you can actually start picking up skills in the core section. Technically speaking, you could build all 4 basic skills if you really wanted to, but that's probably never going to define any of the builds that you'll see in Diablo 4. Down in the core skills, we are starting to see 2 things emerge. One, we have resource spenders here. These are going to be skills that you can only use when you have a certain amount of resource or you meet some specific requirement, and you begin to see the interplay of what your skill rotation will look like. On top of that, you start to get passive skill nodes. These are going to, in some way, modify your character as a whole, either bringing new types of defensives, new types of damage, and specifically modifying one aspect or another of every skill use that you have as opposed to a particular skill. For our core skill, I went with Whirlwind. You got to pick up Whirlwind if you're a D2 fanboy. You can see here that it has the core skill tag as well as channeled. Channeled means that it's a skill that as long as you're holding down right click, it's going to happen until it either is interrupted or you run out of the resource, whatever the prerequisite might have. There's no cooldown on any core skill, and obviously it's not going to generate our resource. It actually costs 20 resource per second. So that means if you were at the max natural cap for resource of 100, you could whirlwind for 5 seconds without stopping. Since whirlwind is an AoE skill, it's going to attack every monster within its range. I noticed that most AoE skills tend to have a lower lucky hit chance coefficient. So here we only have a 20% chance to proc it, but it is going to roll that chance to proc on every target that it hits. Skill description says that you're going to rapidly attack all surrounding monsters for 21% of your weapon damage, which on my character just so happened to be 65 to 79 damage. It's a physical damage type and it is a spender skill type, meaning again, it's going to use the resource that we generate from our generator skills. The first enhancement, Enhanced Whirlwind, is actually going to make it so that you generate your primary resource of Fury whenever you hit a monster, and on top of that, you generate additional Fury when hitting an elite monster. So an elite monsters are your boss packs, your champions, the actual bosses inside of things like dungeons, and players in PvP. So this meant with enough monsters in a given area, I was actually able to whirlwind continuously until they were all dead. The second enhancement type that I selected, which is Violent Whirlwind, makes it so that if I'm whirlwinding for at least 2 seconds, I'm going to gain a times 30% modifier on my damage as long as I continue to channel the skill. So if I'm fighting a lot of elite monsters in an area, basically whirlwinding forever, that means after that first 2 seconds, I was just doing X 30% multiplier of additional damage until every monster was dead on the screen. Now here's where each class is really going to differentiate itself, because you have anywhere between like 2 to 3 nodes in this one teal area that I'm just calling general power and cooldowns. But as far as the internodes between your core skills and the ultimate node, which we're about to talk about, you can gain access to very powerful attacks that have long cooldowns, very important buffs or AoE buffs. The barbarian gains access to multiple shouts, which are going to give them additional survivability, additional damage, additional movement speed that all have their own cooldowns, as well as more utility skills, which may carry some damage, but also give you access to greater mobility or opportunities to control the battlefield around you. Really strong passives that are going to define more niche uses of the build. On one of these, the Barbarian just gains inherent access to Thorns damage, which means anytime any monster hits you, they're just going to take that damage. So much better than D2. I just had to plug that in here real quick. That don't necessarily go on to modify other particular skills, but are now just modifying your class as a whole. These skills are so diverse, I couldn't really pick one example that I think showed off the strength of them. But again, they're going to have a single enhancement branch and then one of 2 enhancement options that you can pick. For the passive nodes, these circular nodes, very often they will relate to one another, but you will have to buy one before you can buy the other one. So it wasn't uncommon for me to just put 1 point into one node so I can get to the final node on the tree, but they will typically relate to similar changes to your character and similar buffs that you're receiving. The ultimate node is where you're going to find massive build defining skills, typically have huge cooldowns as well as big screen wide effects. From what I saw, the ultimate skills don't have options for which type of enhancement you can get. You just get 2 of the enhancements. So if you want the skill to change in this way, you would select them, and they are almost always generally a boon to the skill use. In addition to that, in the ultimate node, you may have access to passives as well. These are typically more involved passives that go on to define more niche or powerful aspects of your character build that may relate to a lot of different abilities and not necessarily modify just a singular aspect. You can only have one ultimate at any given time, just to give you a better understanding of just how powerful these skills are supposed to be. For our ultimate ability, we picked Wrath of the Berserker. Wrath of the Berserker was an ultimate skill that had a 57.3 second cooldown. It does look like there are going to be ways for managing cooldown, potentially reducing cooldown. Maybe it's a stat that we can gain access to. And what Wrath of the Berserker does is gives you a massive buff. So you're going to gain Berserking and Unstoppable. And just to very quickly read what those mean, Berserking is going to grant a 25% increase in overall damage and a 30% increase in movement speed. Unstoppable means that all crowd control and movement impaired effects are both removed from your character currently and cannot be applied while you continue to be unstoppable. It goes on to say for the next 10 seconds, dealing direct damage with basic skills grants additional berserking length. So let's try to see how that works together. I use my lunging strike to be able to generate enough fury so that I can use whirlwind. Before I start whirlwinding, I want to do maximum damage here and I don't want to be stopped, so I use Wrath of the Berserker. For the next 10 seconds I have this buff, and for the next 5 seconds I'm berserking as well as unstoppable. I begin to whirlwind. 5 seconds into that, I would normally lose berserking as well as probably running out of fury. So I'm going to stop whirlwinding and use lunging strike again. The lunging strike is both going to give me 5 additional seconds of berserking as well as generate me the fury that I need to continue whirlwinding. So right here you can see how an ultimate ability isn't just going to be some big effect that's going to happen, but can drastically change your skill rotation as well as empower previous skills that probably start to feel a little bit underwhelming the further that you progress. All of a sudden, our basic skill of lunging strike is going to gain us some mobility by moving us towards a target, going to give us berserking, which is absolutely one of the strongest effects that the barbarian has access to, and generate the fury that we need to then be able to use our stronger core skills. The first enhancement to Wrath of the Berserker goes to cement these core ideas that we just talked about. So while it's active, you're going to gain an additional plus 20% movement speed and increase your fury generation by 30%. So now, while we're probably going to want to weave in a basic skill use to keep our berserking up, the fury generation from whirlwind itself is going to be increased. And maybe with this additional percentage increase, it's now viable to maintain it while just whirlwinding the entire time. So not only is it giving additional utility to our basic skills, but now our core skills are more manageable. The second enhancement for the ultimate, and remember there's no choice here, it's just the second skill point that you spend into it will gain you access to this. So here's where things get pretty interesting. While you have Wrath of the Berserker active, every 50 fury that you spend will increase your berserker's damage increase by times 25% modifier. Now let's think about that. We lunge into battle, we use our Wrath of the Berserker, we begin to whirlwind. After 2 seconds of whirlwinding, we're going to gain that damage bonus. And since Wrath of the Berserker is gaining us additional fury, we're able to whirlwind for longer. Every 2.5 seconds, which is how long it would take us to spend 50 fury, our berserking damage bonus is going to increase. And before berserking runs out, we can reuse a basic skill, gaining us additional fury and increasing our berserk length by 5 seconds, to then go back into whirlwinding, start whirlwinding for another 2.5 seconds, we get the next 30% increase here, and then an additional plus 25% increase on our berserk damage. So that's just how these 3 individual skills all weave together the moment that you have access to them. And if you look at this picture again, there are a lot of skills with a lot of passive opportunities. And we haven't even gotten down to the bottom of this skill tree yet. The bottom of the barbarian skill tree are these big passives. These are another skill type that you can only select one of, and they mark the end of your skill tree progression. These are going to have different identities that are going to go on to modify a major aspect of your overall build and either bring a lot of utility, damage, or overall functionality to your skill rotation. Just to give you an idea of what some of these do, the first one here is called Unconstrained. This is going to increase the total length of time that you have a berserk effect up. Typically, berserking only lasts for 5 seconds. This means that a single berserk effect could last for 10 seconds. And it's just going to add a flat X 25% modifier of the damage bonus that berserk gains access to. The second one here is something called Walking Arsenal. Now, the Arsenal system or the Barbarian specialization would require its own video, but basically you have a secondary skill tree-like bonus that's going to gain you different damage bonuses depending on the weapon type that you're using, because that barbarian actually gains access to 4 different weapons that are used for different skills interchangeably. Every time you use a particular weapon type, so bludgeoning, slashing, or dual wielding, you're going to gain a flat amount of additional damage. And if you can stack all 3 of those bonuses, meaning that you've swapped between using a big bludgeoning attack and then a spinning slashing attack, and then you've used some type of dual weapon attack, you're going to gain an additional increase in damage. So while your first big passive is probably just a good overall option here, you know, your berserk is just more effective, the second passive requires you to have a particular playstyle where you're often swapping between your different weapons in your arsenal using a varied amount of different skills. The third big passive that barbarians gain is Unbridled Rage. This says that your core skills are going to deal a massive amount of additional damage. So right now it says a times 135% multiplier, but they're going to cost an additional 100% resource. So if we look at Whirlwind again, Whirlwind's resource cost would go from 20 to 40. And while you may consider that to be a negative impact or a cost to pay, remember how that could synergize with some of the other skills that we've talked about. Wrath of the Berserker says when you spend a certain amount of resource, increase the damage of your berserking cost. You can speed up the rate that you increase your berserking damage by increasing the cost of Whirlwind. And since your Fury generation and your Whirlwind generates Fury, again, there are scenarios where you're effectively Whirlwinding even though the cost just went up, but you are stacking damage faster. And the last passive that the Barbarian has access to is called Gushing Wounds. And what this basically says is if you ever kill a monster that has a bleed effect on it, they're going to explode, applying a bleed effect to all the monsters within its radius. So this passive is going to go on to define one of the niche versions of the Barbarian build, which is applying bleed effects. So you may be doing less damage up front, potentially applying AoE dots to everything within its vicinity, which then have their opportunities of proccing different abilities, etc. And while all those numbers might change or some of the specifics might change, that just goes a really long way to give you an idea of what these big passive skills at the end of your skill tree are meant to do to help better define and overall shape the total progression of your character's build via the skill tree. Just to wrap it all up again, while these systems are probably going to look very similar to what we ultimately get our hands on when Diablo 4 releases, the numbers, the skill descriptions, the effects, and any of the screenshots that I just showed you are absolutely subject to change. None of this is finalized. I just want to put that out there. And I just want to make sure that I double back and say it again, because it's really important to remember that when taking in any content related to this press release beta that people got their hands on. While I talked about my first impressions earlier in the video, I just want to say again, the skill tree system might be one of my favorite things that I saw in the game as it stands right now. I think it's a breath of fresh air and is definitely a great and natural progression from what we have seen in previous Diablo titles. Going through and reading each individual skill and all of their enhancements and all of the passives took me a long time to just even come up with what I wanted my build path to be. And then when I started gaining access to the skills I decided I wanted to spec into, the more and more the playstyle came together, my skill rotation really cemented itself, and the power fantasy of the character I was expecting to play really began to unfold. This is definitely a big departure from something if you're coming from my Diablo 2 community that we're used to playing with, but I can promise you it felt amazing, and I'm so excited to see what the ultimate structure looks like when the game releases and to start theory crafting the best builds possible in Diablo 4. I hope that this video was informational. I know it was a bit much, but there's just so much to cover, and I wanted to try to create at least a stepping stone for a comprehensive guide, just so that people can walk into this game having a much better understanding of what they're gonna need to do to successfully create a character that can slay the endless hordes of demons that we'll inevitably encounter once we all get our hands on Diablo 4. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.